Hi Year 12s, this is your Tuesday psychology lesson where we're continuing with the psychopathology topic. We'll get started straight away with the retrieval. So I want you to just grab a blank piece of paper, pause me while you do this obviously, and I want you to retrieve all of the knowledge that you have, think really broadly on the behavioural approach. Okay, so blank canvas, blank sheet of paper, as much as you possibly can. Okay. So having done that, hopefully you picked up on that link there, blank canvas, tabula rasa, this idea that we are born a blank canvas according to the behavioural approach and we learn everything. And what I'd like you to do is just take a few minutes to have a look at what's on the board there, or what's on the screen I should say, and see what you managed to include, but more importantly what you didn't. So did you forget to talk about the key studies, things like Pavlov's dogs? Did you forget to mention operant conditioning as one of the 3 ways in which we learn, and that idea about there being positive as well as negative reinforcement? Did you remember to mention that the social learning theory was a later development and included the role of cognitions, those mediational processes? So just use that almost as a checklist, and of course there's many more things you might have put on there as well. And at the very bottom there you've got some of the evaluative points, that it focuses on the role of nurture. What I would say is that if you're vague on any of this and you don't feel secure in your knowledge of the approaches topic, go back, stop this, go back and spend however much time needed. Drop me an email if you need help. Use your revision pack, use your notes, use the flashcards that you created at the time, but just really be strong in your knowledge of the behavioural approach, because we're going to be applying classical and operant conditioning to the issue of phobias. We're going to be using language like unconditioned stimulus, and if you're not secure in that, you're just going to get in a real muddle. Okay, so be honest with yourself and take that time if you need it. For those of us that are ploughing on with this then, last lesson I set you a little bit of a challenge and I asked you to work out what each of these phobias were, what you were afraid of if you had these things. And there's your answers there on the board. And you can see actually that, having that awareness of the word roots really helps us. Hemoglobin, we associate it with blood. Aqua, of course, water. Aerophobia, fear of flying, think of an aeroplane. And we find that, this is sort of just the example of phobias, but in psychology we often find that breaking down the word and thinking about the word root helps us to make sense of it, especially when we look at some of the scientific words. I had asked you to think about why I'd highlighted 2 of them, social phobia and agoraphobia, and I asked you to think about what the DSM says. So if we have a look at the knowledge organiser, just to put it into the bigger picture, last lesson when we were introducing phobias and we were thinking about what a phobia is and defining it, we talked about using that DSM, that Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Remember, that's that reference book that clinicians use, and it builds a really good picture of each of these mental disorders. There's 3 categories of phobias. There's the specific phobias, all of those things where there's a specific thing that you're afraid of, for example, spiders, arachnophobia. But then there's the social phobia, which is a more general category. And social phobias can include a phobia of speaking in public, a phobia of social situations, crowds, parties, making a fool of yourself in public. It can be a number of different things, so it's a more generalized category. And then agoraphobia is treated sort of in its own right. Agoraphobia is that fear of open spaces, and if you think about it, that can be really debilitating, and that is treated as a unique phobia because of the vast nature of it. Basically, you're afraid of everything outside, you're afraid of open spaces. So last lesson, when we were looking at this and we were thinking about what a phobia is, you'll remember we looked at the 3 different areas of characteristics. So, and we do this with any disorder. So we say, what are the behavioural characteristics? What do you do? How do you behave if you have it? What are the emotional? So how do you feel if you have it? And what are the cognitive characteristics? How do you think? What's going on in there if you have this disorder? And we applied that to phobias. What we're going to move on to is thinking about why. Why does somebody have a phobia? The behavioural approach tells us we're born a blank canvas. We know there's a couple of fears that do seem to be innate and that you do seem to have as an infant. For example, a fear of loud noises and a fear of darkness or being alone. And that's why babies cry a lot when they feel, you know, they're on their own, or when it's lights out at night time. But apart from those two, the behavioural approach would say everything else, any other phobia you might have, a phobia of spiders, a phobia of birds, you must have learned it somehow, you've acquired it somehow. And so what we're going to be exploring is what the behavioural approach tells us as to why we form a phobia in the first place, and then why we keep it, why we often keep it into our adulthood. So we're looking at how we acquire a phobia and how we maintain a phobia. And that's where our classical and our operant conditioning are really going to come in. And this is what Maurer called the two-step or two-process model. So that's an important name for us. Maurer, the person who came up with it, and the name of the process itself. So that's where we're going to be taking this lesson. But before we do that, pause me again, follow this link which is on your PowerPoint, and just go to this quick quiz. It's only 8 questions, and it's just to allow you to assess your knowledge of the psychopathology topic so far. It's multiple choice, it won't take you a few minutes, and then use that to create the flashcards and to see where the gaps in your knowledge are, because that's going to be quite important as we're building all of this up and we're painting this picture of, you know, how we define abnormality, different examples of abnormality, how we explain them, and how we treat them. Okay, so go along to that. If where your gaps are, you've already got flashcards, it's just a sign that you need to revisit them more often. Put them to the top of your pile, keep testing yourself on them until it's secure. Get into those good sort of study habits. Okay, so we've come across the case of little Albert before. This isn't new to us, but we never really dug that deep. We just referred to it when we were looking at our early behaviourists, and Watson, the person who was responsible for this study, was one of our early behaviourists. And what Watson wanted to do is, he'd seen the example of Pavlov. He'd seen how Pavlov managed to classically condition the dogs. He had seen how Pavlov had managed to manipulate the behaviour of the dogs and make them do something when faced with a neutral stimulus, the bell, make them salivate. And Watson wanted to know, does that work with humans? Can we classically condition a human to behave a certain way when faced with a particular stimulus? And that's what the case study of little Albert's all about. But it's really relevant for us here because, of course, what Watson chose to do was classically condition little Albert to develop a phobia of a white rat in particular. So on the PowerPoint, when you click on the image, it will take you to a little video summary. And underneath the image, that web link is some additional notes. So there's a video to watch and there's some reading to do. And what I'd like you to do, and really do take some time on this, probably 15-20 minutes, is watch the video, do the reading, and create yourself a key study card. So really condense it down, just a bullet point style approach. We've done these before for other key studies. What did he do? So what steps did he go through with little Albert, the baby, the infant? What did he find? And what are the general conclusions or the implications of this study? Because it has had massive implications to our understanding. And that's, you know, that's quite a hefty job there. So this is probably more than an hour's worth. In total, this lesson's probably more than an hour's worth of learning, so you might decide to pause it and come back to it. But what I'll do is on Wednesday, I'll keep the lesson quite brief. On Wednesday, we'll just be going on and doing a little bit of evaluation, and I'll be giving you feedback on your essays. Okay, so spend some time doing that for now. I'm really getting to grips with the little Albert case study. And having done that, you can now do this for me. Pavlov's dogs, going right the way back to the approaches topic. Little Albert, just visited it there. And going back to the attachment topic, still applying exactly the same principle. We're asking the why question, why do attachments form? What I'd like you to do then is just literally fill in that table. Let's get ourselves really familiar and really confident with using that language, the unconditioned stimulus, the neutral stimulus. So have a go. It doesn't matter if you make mistakes, really retrieve it, concentrate on it, and then we can see where the gaps are. Okay. So having done that, let's review our answers. Going right the way back to Pavlov, we know we gave the dogs the food. That was the unconditioned stimulus. We haven't interfered with anything here. The response of the dogs without any sort of interference was that they salivated. They smelt it, it got their salivation going. We then decided we'd start that process of conditioning. So we were getting them to make that association. Every time the food was brought to them, the bell was rung. So the bell was the neutral stimulus. We know the neutral stimulus always becomes the conditioned stimulus. See the pattern there? That always stays the same in every example. Because what we've done is we've conditioned. So now we can just use the neutral stimulus, which is now the conditioned stimulus, because that process has taken place. And we'll get that same response. So we'll get the conditioned response. We could take the food away and the dog will still salivate at the bell. We can take the food away and the child will still gain that satisfaction and comfort at seeing mum. So the early forming of attachment. We can take the loud noise away and little Albert will still cry and show that fear response to the white rat. So the neutral stimulus has become the conditioned stimulus. Make sure you're confident with that language, because you'll see in a moment it really helps us when faced with exam questions. What I have added on to the end of the little Albert case here, where we're trying to explain how a phobia forms, why we acquire a phobia, we've classically conditioned ourselves to associate a negative, traumatic, upsetting experience with that phobic object, is generalization. And you'll have seen it in the little video clip there that you were watching about little Albert. What happens with most phobias is we'll have developed a specific phobia in the first place to something very specific, but we'll have generalized it, and that's when it really becomes debilitating. So we had a traumatic experience involving a particular dog, let's say an Alsatian dog, when we were young. We've generalized, we've made that association between dog and that upset and that frightened feeling. We've therefore developed a phobia of dogs, but it's not just Alsatian dogs anymore. We've generalized it to all dogs. So now it's really starting to interfere with our life, because we can't cut across the park and we can't go out with certain, to certain places because we feel that panic coming on. That's the generalization bit that Watson identified had happened to little Albert. With little Albert, he generalized it to things that moved in a similar way to the white rat, that had the same characteristics like the white fluffiness. So even Santa's beard became a phobic object. And generalization kind of can make a phobia absolutely life debilitating, so that you can't function adequately. Okay, so we'll have a look at how we might use that principle in an exam context. So I'm not asking you to do this question. We're just going to look at it as an example so that you can see how you might apply that language. So I'm hoping I'm going to be able to annotate here. You'll have to excuse, it will be terrible writing. First of all, I read on and I see, right, okay, I'm dealing with phobias here. And I've got Sammy, so I know if I was answering the question, I'd need to refer to Sammy. We always use the names, don't we? This started when he was 3, a seagull. So I know I've got a seagull here, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, so we've got a phobia of birds, and it was a seagull that was originally at the scene of the crime, so to speak, and it frightened him. So I'm thinking here that that's my unconditioned, oh my goodness me, that is terrible, isn't it? That's my unconditioned response. Fear. He was frightened. And what caused him to be frightened? Well, it swooped down and it stole his sandwich. How terrible. So actually that bit there is my unconditioned stimulus. That's the thing that initially happened that caused him to be frightened. So the swooping down, basically the attack, and the response to that attack was he was frightened. He probably cried. He's only 3 years old. What's the seagull then? It's my neutral stimulus, which will become, what does the neutral stimulus always become? It will become my conditioned stimulus. So all I've got to work out now is what will be my conditioned response. Well, he's afraid of birds. He's got a phobia. My conditioned response is that now, every time he sees a bird, he is going to experience that same probably sort of panicky crying fit, anxious. He's a bit older now, he's 8. He might not burst into tears, but he might feel himself getting a bit panicky every time he sees a bird. He's generalised it. It's birds now. It's not just seagulls. And it's because that neutral stimulus has become the conditioned stimulus, and he's made that association between seagulls and between that horrible feeling that he got when that one incident happened. And the behavioural approach tells us it only takes one incident. You've formed the association, there's no going back from that, you've learned it, you've made that association, you've been classically conditioned, and that explains step one in Maurer's two-step process. That's why the phobia forms, classical conditioning. We could see it again here with Kirsty. Now, I'd like you to have a go at this. I'm not actually bothered about you doing the 4-mark question. It's that process of annotation that I want you to concentrate on. I want you to really think about where in this item do we find out what the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response are, because then that helps us to think about how we would tackle that question. So take some time, pause me, annotate it, pull it apart, and think about applying that language to it. Okay, so that's step one. That is how we form a phobia. Step two in Maurer's process is about asking ourselves, why do we keep it? Why, once we've had this traumatic experience and we've developed a phobia, does that phobia stay with us for years? Actually, for most people, unless they seek treatment for it, they'll always have that phobia and they'll always have that same response. This is where I'm asking you to activate your knowledge and go back to the principle of operant conditioning, learning through reinforcement. And I just want you to have a think. I've put on there image of aspirin, or let's imagine paracetamol or some sort of painkiller tablet. What's that got to do with operant conditioning? Have a think. What's that got to do with operant conditioning? If you went along the route in thinking about that of negative reinforcement, well done. Because you'll remember when we learned about operant conditioning, we said it's all about explaining how you will repeat a behaviour because you're rewarded in some way. And that can be positive reinforcement, where literally you're rewarded, you get something good as a result of what you've done, so you'll do it again. But it can also explain why we repeat a behaviour through negative reinforcement. I'll do it again because it stopped a negative consequence. I had a headache, which was unpleasant. That's my negative consequence. I took a tablet, paracetamol, let's say, and it stopped the headache. So I'm going to do that again. The next time I have a headache, I've learned that's the right thing to do. It applies to phobias. I've got a phobia. I developed it because I had that traumatic experience when I was young. Let's use Kirsty and her balloons. What I've started to do, what I did one time was I got invited to a children's birthday party and I didn't go. I didn't go because I couldn't bear the thought of having a panic attack and that horrible feeling that I knew I would have as soon as I saw a balloon. I was rewarded by that because I didn't have a panic attack. So my avoiding a situation stopped a negative consequence. I didn't have a panic attack. So I'm going to do that again. I get invited to a friend's wedding a few weeks later. I'm not going to go because that strategy worked for me last time. It's going to work for me again. I'm not going to have a panic attack. Negative reinforcement. And Maurer says that's how we maintain our phobias, because it means we never face up to them. All we're doing is we're avoiding, and we're maintaining it by avoidance. And we know that's one of the behavioural characteristics of having a phobia, that we'll see that person avoid certain situations so they haven't got to face up to the thing that they're so afraid of. So that's step 2 of Maurer's process. Page reference of the textbook, just so you can do a little reading around this. Pretty much everything in there I've said or I've explained, but obviously it's useful to have it. So it's page 144, 145. Some of the language that I've referred to in today's lesson, so it might be useful to turn that into a flashcard or add it to a glossary. Just make sure you're comfortable with that. And then here are a few suggestions for flashcards. So based off what we've done today, explaining the behavioural explanation for phobias, Maurer's 2-process model, how we acquire phobias, so classical conditioning, how we maintain phobias. You could create yourself some flashcards on that. On Wednesday, as I say, I'll keep the lesson brief because I appreciate by the time you've done all of this, it's probably closer to 2 hours work rather than 1. What we'll do on Wednesday is just a little bit of evaluation about this, how good an explanation for phobias is this? And I'll give you the feedback on the essays. So that is my prompt to say, those of you who have not yet sent me your essays, please do. Okay, I've had 6 of them, sorry, I've had from 6 of you, and thank you very much to those of you who have sent them, but I'm still awaiting 5. If there's a problem, if you're struggling, if you've not been well, just drop me an email, let me know. But I'd really like you to sort of touch base, and I'd really like to receive some work from everybody so I can just see how you're getting on, okay? So please send those through, and I'll give a little bit of feedback on the ones that I've received on Wednesday in the lesson, and there won't be a lesson on Friday, of course, because it's bank holiday. All right, so that's just sort of laying the stall out for the rest of the week so that you can manage your time. That's it from me then. Stay safe, stay at home, and I will see you soon.